sure why this slide's not showing up, but what it basically is to address this problem of spotted wing, we kind of initiate a number of different research and extension projects, actually. The research framed around sort of 3 topics that's supposed to be shown here. I'm not sure why it's not, but hopefully the rest of these slides will be okay. Under sort of questions about basic biology, the kind of things that Larry just said, we didn't know a lot about this insect, so that we spent some time and have been spending some time looking at sort of some basic questions about things like whether they have a diapause, can they tolerate the kinds of winters we have in these more northern latitudes, what kinds of natural enemies are there present, and this kind of thing. We also were asking some questions about dispersal, but I really got to commend the kind of work that Larry just described as really excellent in giving us a better sense of that relative to monitoring. Then we are also, of course, need to look at management solutions, both on the short term. You know, what can our growers use now to basically stay in business? And we had a number of growers that were kind of on the edge of going out of business, or at least going out of the business of growing berry crops. In that industry, they really didn't even have a history of spraying many insecticides. We don't have a lot of other crops or other insect pests. And so faced with spotted wing, we were, you know, behind the 8 ball in terms of how to deal with that. So we've been looking at various aspects, including monitoring and early warning, things about insecticide efficacy and insecticide deliveries. We've also been looking at exclusion netting as kind of a short-term solution for being able to grow these vulnerable crops without using many insecticides at all. Then we also initiated research that I consider more long-term, and our work is focused a lot on sort of how we can manipulate behavior of spotted wing Drosophila through the use of repellents or attracting kill stations that might provide some help in managing these pests without, you know, broad spectrum, multiple sprays during the harvest season. Okay, so let me get into some of the 2 topics I want to focus on. That is sort of this question of overwintering biology and tolerance and the use of non-crop hosts. Let me just ask, because I can't really see everybody, is this next picture pretty much coming on okay?
Yes, it is.
Okay, good. Maybe that was just that one slide that was kind of messed up. So here is sort of a picture of the seasonal biology of spotted wing in upstate New York, which I think is not that different from Michigan, based on these adult monitoring traps. And what we typically see, you start in the spring, and I think I can use my pointer here, you see, depending on the year, virtually no captures from around January through sometime in between June and later July, and that does vary by season. So our earliest so far has been June 6th, first adult capture, and we've been monitoring for the last 5 years, and our latest was July 18th, so about a 3-week interval. And then we typically see pretty low populations in the traps until we get into July and into August, and then August is huge populations that build up, and that's where we see the worst amount of infestations, such that the crops that in our area that are most vulnerable are later varieties of blueberries and then fall raspberries, and they get hit the hardest. Summer raspberries varies. Some years we get significant damage, some years we haven't. And then blueberries, again, earlier cultivars, earlier maturing cultivars, often don't get any damage for us at levels that are important to our growers, where our markets are generally not retail, some retail, but certainly not international, where we mostly consume or purchase things on farm stands, et cetera. So it's a different industry than what you have in Michigan for sure. Okay, so then we see these high populations that continue into the fall. I'll show you a picture later on what this looks like in the woods versus the field, but we see sort of a continually catching adults in the field, although these traps are actually on the edge of a agricultural crop. And then they kind of drop off, as I said, late fall into December, where we don't catch much, and then after the end of December, we don't catch anything. Okay, so what's going on in this kind of seasonal phenology? How do we understand that? And there's a number of questions that we're starting to get some answers to, but this is kind of galvanized, these questions have galvanized our research. So one question is sort of what life stage overwinters? And I'll just say, I don't show any data on this, but it looks like it's the adult, with the adult female seeming to be a little bit more tolerant of the kinds of cold temperatures that we experience in these more northern latitudes. Is there a reproductive diapause? What kinds of physiological and morphological changes go on in this insect to help them survive these cold winter conditions with lack of food? What habitats, what's their behavior, where do they go in terms of finding places to spend the winter, and actually how tolerant are these flies? Then sort of moving on into the spring, what's going on in that spring? As Larry mentioned, what's going on where we're not, things are warming up and we're not catching flies, at least in the traps we have, whether we put them in the woods or not, actually. So, are the flies there in the spring? What are they feeding on? Are they reproducing? Or secondarily, are we seeing some component of our infestations coming from outside our area, from the south, where populations are more advanced phenologically? Are they coming up on storm fronts, etc.? And then kind of also related to this spring and then summer and late summer question is, what is the use of non-crop hosts sort of in the wilder landscapes around our agricultural fields? Which of these species are being utilized? How important are they? What's their seasonal use model? How much exchange is there between the non-crop host and the crop? And how much are these non-crop hosts contributing to our risk of infestation? We think the answers to a lot of these sort of basic questions about the biology of this insect can provide insights into our management strategies. So this diagram kind of just illustrates the area I want to focus on, at least initially, is this idea that we have this big time period where apparently there's no reproduction going on. What are the flies doing? Are there things that are going on in terms of the flies preparing for winter? How do they survive that cold winter condition in our areas? What's going on in the spring after they've sort of emerged, where temperatures are warmed up? And then there's the whole active reproduction period during the field season. Okay, so this is just a kind of an example of the kind of temperatures these flies are experiencing over a year. And you notice on top I mentioned some older data from Japan indicating that the lethal temperature for spotted wing Drosophila males and females is a little below freezing, but not much, like a degree or two. Now this original work was done on non-adapted flies sort of coming out of their colonies, so that you got to keep that in mind. But clearly a typical winter, an ambient temperature, we're well below that 1 degree, -1 degree condition. So how do flies survive this? And one question we want to ask is, well, are the flies adapting in various ways to cold conditions or other aspects of the winter to allow them to survive? And we've identified a couple mechanisms for that. One is sort of related to diapause, this reproductive arrest. What kind of winter stress tolerance can the flies develop as they enter these diapause, for example, if they enter diapause? Cold tolerance, starvation tolerance, desiccation tolerance. And then where do they go for overwintering? In doing trapping in various areas, one of the things we found was some initial evidence that there does seem to be a reproductive diapause or reproductive arrest in this species, where we capture flies, dissect them to look at their egg development over the season. And what we see, and this has been verified in our lab studies, is that as day length drops below 12 hours, we see kind of decreasing numbers and proportions of the females carrying eggs based on wild-caught flies until it goes close to 0 as we get into November and early December, kind of indicating there's some sort of reproductive arrest in Drosophila zuzukii. As I said, we've looked at this in the lab to try to get a better sense of the cues that might induce this. It looks like it is related to photoperiod and temperature that can result in physiological changes that the fly allows it to kind of be better equipped over winter, and it becomes non-reproductive at least for a while It seems to be a rather shallow type of diapause based on our lab results anyhow, in which they're able to come back into reproductive state fairly quickly. The sensitive stage, you know, we're still not 100% sure, but it looks like it's the adult, recently a closed adult, the time period after the adult comes out of the pupal stage. If it's experiencing shorter day lengths and cooler temperatures, it will go into reproductive diapause at least for a while. Beyond this kind of photoperiod induction, there also seems to be the flies has a capacity to adapt to cooler, colder temperatures, something we refer to as developmental acclimation. If the insect is developing under cooler temperatures, it develops some characteristics that may aid in its ability to survive cold temperatures. It develops a darker integument, a thicker integument. It's a larger body size and longer wings, something we refer to, and other people studying this, as a wintermorph kind of morphology, a winter morphology shown here in this lower picture, compared to a summertime morphology of a smaller insect. So if the fruit fly is developing under cooler temperatures, 15 degrees or so Celsius, they'll develop this kind of wintermorph material. And if they're experiencing shorter day lengths, they will go into at least a temporary reproductive diapause. The flies also can acclimate to cold temperatures as adults simply through experiencing cool temperature. They can have, to some extent, rapid cold hardening, which is limited, a longer kind of cold acclimation where they have a little more time to adjust. They winter diapause due to a response to an external cue. So let me show a little bit of the results we have looking at this winter stress tolerance to try to give us a sense of how cold tolerant these flies can be, and maybe then we can judge a little better how likely they are to survive in our environments. This is an experiment I want to mention. Anna Wallingford did a lot of this work, a postdoc in my lab, and she did a lot of stuff kind of setting up cohorts of flies under different conditions and looking at their response to different temperatures and asking how they handle that. So in this case, and we can look at that in different ways, looking at their behavior, their ability to respond to cold, extra cold temperature, etc. In some of these first experiments, we worked with 3 types of flies. One were these summer morph flies we mentioned earlier. They're out of our lab colony in this case, but they're reared under warm temperatures and long day length. We created some flies called long day winter morphs, where they're experiencing long days, but they're put into cold temperatures, and as they develop, they produce this darker type of winter morph fly, and then we keep them at 10 degrees. And then just the same thing as a short day winter morph, where we try to more mimic what we think is going on in late season, where they're developing under cool temperatures and then are experiencing short day lengths. So one way we can measure this is these flies, after going through these conditions, is how they recover to a cold stress of different temperatures. You know, an X amount of time put at cold temperatures, and then asking, do they recover over a 60-minute recovery period? This is a common way that the Drosophila biologists look at this question in other Drosophilids, so we sort of adopted that approach. And what we see here is that at 1 degrees, or even at 0 degrees centigrade, the unacclimated supermorphs, the kind of flies that Kimura study looked at, really didn't recover very well after 60 minutes. Whereas our wintermorph flies that developed under cool temperatures did quite well, even at down to -3 degrees, where we start seeing a differentiation between day length, effects of day length. Whereas the short day wintermorphs were recovering quite well and very active, even some of them down to -5 degrees centigrade. And we think that's kind of getting into their tolerance level for these well-adapted flies, the adults, at least over short-term stress is about -5 centigrade. We've also looked at this question comparing actually field-caught flies in the late season in October and November, and looked at the sort of same question about recovery at -3 degrees and compared it to our lab, our artificially produced short-day wintermorphs. And what we see basically is that they show a pretty similar pattern to what we see in field-caught individuals, and this is for, I think, male and female flies here. Sort of pretty similar patterns, making us feel fairly confident that our lab-produced simulated wintermore flies are fairly representative of the kind of flies that are out there in late season, suggesting that the flies we're catching right now, we're still catching some around here, ought to be able to handle things around -3 degrees, -5 degrees, at least over a short time period. Of course, we know it gets a lot more cold than that, so that's a question to consider. We also look at this. Yeah? Is there a question?
Nope.
Okay, thanks. So we've also looked at this idea of adult acclimation to cold tolerance, comparing these sort of lab colony summer morphs with flies that get hardened, experiencing a short amount of time under cold temperature and long days, 24 hours. Then we compare that to the acclimated flies that developed under cold temperatures. And what we see is that if you look at percent kill coma recovery for males and females, we do see that just some experience to cold temperature provides some protection to cold temperature, in this case -1 degree centigrade. Our cold acclimated short day flies are fine at 1 degree in males and females. And again, our unacclimated flies struggle to kind of recover from even a pretty minor cold temperature. Okay, well, hopefully I've shown you enough of the data to convince you that these flies have a limited capacity to handle cold temperatures, but not extremely cold temperatures that we might see in the open air. The question we're now asking really now is, okay, where are the flies going over the winter time, and are they getting themselves in habitats where they might only experience temperatures slightly below freezing, compared to what we know goes on typically in our environments in the ambient air. So this graph here kind of shows a typical temperature profile for January through March in 2013-14, and you see that air temperature gets down in that year quite cold. That was one of those really cold winters, down to -20 degrees centigrade. But when we put a temperature probe in the soil, or right below the soil organic matter in the soil surface, if flies happen to be in that location, they actually didn't experience temperatures much below 0. So depending where the flies are, they may actually have a capacity to survive. And so that's one of the questions we've been looking at. I don't have a lot of data to show you about trying to figure out where these flies are going in the winter. We know they tend to move towards the woods. We know that there's been some evidence of rearing flies in the spring out of in woodlots, sort of from the ground, from organic matter, leaf litter kinds of situations. And we think that's part of it, but they may be making other choices. We did an interesting experiment last winter where we released wintermore flies in a flight kind of zone, or actually a cage outside, and it provided them some different habitats like leaf litter, bare soil, logs, and the wintermore flies were pretty good at moving into protected environments, actually in the leaf litter, actually even under the pot we had, and sometimes with the logs. So we think those habitats are relevant. Our summermore flies we put out, they all died in fairly mild temperatures. So I think we need to do more about that, but right now we think at least some of these flies are going into the leaf litter to spend at least some of the winter. So kind of that's where we're at right now. We do have an experiment planned this year that we're going to hopefully do across the country as part of that SCRI grant that has been mentioned, from far south as Georgia to as far north as Maine, and this is also going to go in both Michigan and New York, where we're going to put out cold-adapted flies in the field in conditions sort of in the ground under leaf litter, and then periodically harvest those flies and ask, what percentage is surviving over the winter. And we hope, here's just a picture of what we think it's going to look like, and based on a pilot project we did last year. And our hope is that we'll be able to get a better handle on the proportion of flies that can make it through our winters or winters further south, and that might give insights into what kind of populations we expect to be around in the springtime to present risks to our crops. Okay, so that's kind of where we're at with our work on overwintering success. I don't know how I'm doing with time, whether I want to check to see if we have any questions right now, or let me go on to wild hosts.
Question? Question? Can't see me.
Okay.
Somebody up front. Somebody up front.
So there is a question. Go ahead, Mark.
Go ahead, Mark. Okay, so really interesting data. I wonder, though, what the impact of typical snow load and the warmth underneath that. Oftentimes, grass is just fine, it's wet. What about survival in those conditions?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's what we hope we'll be able to get a sense of by kind of doing these experiments in different sites. We will get snow part of the winter here, and I'm sure they will in the plots in Michigan, and the experiments designed to allow natural snow cover. Certainly, we have temperature probes, and we'll be getting daily, actually hourly recordings, and we'll be able to see what those conditions look like where the flies are, at least in this experiment. But I think you're right. A good snow cover is likely to keep temperatures in the 0-degree range. And in fact, it may be ideal conditions for these flies to be kind of cold, but not super cold. It might actually be worse for them to go through periodic warm-ups. Let's suppose it's at least for us, I think you guys too, last winter, it's a pretty mild winter. We had some really cold temperatures, actually without much snow cover, and then some warming temperatures, and if the flies kind of warming up and getting their metabolism going, they may actually burn out faster than if they were sitting under a nice cold or at least a cool condition under snow. So I think that's a very important observation or question that we need to get a better handle on. Okay, so let me touch on overwintering, or excuse me, non-crop hosts, and what we know so far about it. Again, this is another picture of one of our research areas where we were trapping both in the woods and in the raspberry. No, maybe this one a blueberry field. It's one of the two. I can't remember. Where we detect them early summer, but don't really see much big population growth until August. That's where we see our most severe infestation. But once we start detecting them, we tend to find more of these flies, or catch more of these flies in traps in the woods than in the agricultural field. And this is an often observed pattern. There's plenty of flies out there in the woods, at least on the edges of these crops. So the question we're asking is, what's going on in the woods? Are they reproducing out there? When do they start reproducing? Are they actually reproducing in the spring before we ever really catch the flies in our crops that aren't getting ripe until, for us, as maybe late June, might be our first susceptible crops getting ripe, mid to late June in strawberry, which incidentally, we really haven't found much evidence of infestation in June-bearing strawberry. Or our summer raspberries, those kinds of things where we get into later June, early July. So, now why should we care about these wild hosts? As I mentioned, they could be providing a source of reproduction in the spring to build up populations that could move into our berry crops or other crops when they get ripe. Or just more generally, could they build up on these wild hosts through the whole season and continually kind of move into our crop plants, providing kind of a significant risk. In general, what are the risk factors of these susceptible crops? Which crops are important? And what management potential is there if we do decide these wild hosts are important? So one of the experiments we did a few years ago, and we repeated it 2 years, is to go to some berry crop sites in the Finger Lakes area up towards Lake Ontario, and start at the beginning of the active season in May, and monitor potential wild hosts growing near these berry crops, and collecting fruit as it gets ripe, and assessing that fruit for infestation, basically, of spotted wing Drosophila. So this is an example of a site we did this at. This had a small blueberry crop actually here on the edge of a wooded area. And a lot of our fields are like this, pretty small berry crop plantings. And then adjacent often we'll have kind of woodlots or other kinds of wild habitat. So we kind of monitored fruit in both of these zones, the crop and here. And some of our examples of the wild hosts we looked at are, and I'll show you more information on this, is bush honeysuckle, Lonicera, wild blackberry rubus of various kind of genetic sources, and pokeweed are three examples down there that we often see actually on the edge of woods next to our agricultural crops. So to kind of get a look at some of these crops that we found, just for reference, this is the sort of the fruiting season for these different plants: strawberry, summer raspberry, our blueberry crop, our day neutral strawberries up here, and then fall raspberries here in August, September, and beyond. So here are just some of the lists, and you can see some of these crops are fruiting fairly early: bush honeysuckle and some of these wild raspberries, black raspberry. A lot of them fruiting a little bit middle season, a lot of different potential hosts middle season, and it shifts over. And then some are only really available late season, like these viburnum and pokeweed and buckthorn. So what kind of things did we find out by monitoring all of these wild crops, where they grew next to our berry crops? And this is sort of the overall pattern of flies reared from these various wild hosts. And interesting to me, anyhow, is that even though we had some plants that were getting ripe in late June, early July, we didn't rear anything out until mid-July, and not a lot until we get into August period. So it's actually kind of similar what we're seeing in the berry crops, where we'll get infestation in the later cultivars of blueberry, maybe a little bit in summer raspberry, but a lot in fall raspberry and day neutral strawberry. We also found flies coming out in September and October from wild hosts, and they sort of petered out at the end of October. Some of the wild hosts that looked important, we measured it in terms of how many flies we reared out per weight of fruit. So we collected 50 to 100 fruit from a plant on a weekly basis, brought it in, weighed it, and then reared out the flies. And the average is kind of shown here. In the year I'm showing you, silky dogwood, Cornus species, was the kind of the most productive in terms of flies per gram. Blackberries and honeysuckle were also pretty productive, going down to buckwheat, buckthorn, and nightshade, which didn't get a lot out of nightshade, even though it was blooming later in the season, or fruiting later in the season. Here's some of these species kind of showing the timing of fruit availability. So blackberry and bush honeysuckle have pretty long seasons, starting in that sort of earlier part of the fruiting season and continuing actually into late August for bush honeysuckle. Pokeweed tends to be late season, August to September. Silky dogwood was sort of mid-season. Buckthorn, down here is late season. Gray dogwood, kind of mid to late season also. So it looks like a number of these wild hosts are being utilized by spotted wing Drosophila. They can be important sources of reproduction for the flies, especially it looks like later in the season, in that late July, August, September time period, where there looks like they're producing a lot of flies. There's a lot of ripe fruit available in the wild host, and they're producing a lot of flies. Not in our area, not so much, at least on fruit, do they seem to be reproducing early in the season, and we've seen this over a couple of years study. So how do we evaluate the importance of wild hosts? And I think there's a number of factors that are coming into play for our area, and I would guess similar in Michigan. How attractive are these different species to the flies? How good a host is that fruit for larval production? And we did find some hosts that the flies didn't lay eggs in, actually, or if they did, we didn't get much successful reproduction out of. So that's kind of interesting. But a large number of them could be utilized. And then the question is sort of what time of year is the fruit ripe on these wild hosts? So when are they producing offspring that potentially could infest our crop plants, what time of year, how long their fruiting season is might provide some sense of what the risk is, and of course how abundant the host is. And then finally, and this ties right back to some stuff that Larry's getting a handle on, is what's the distance from your crop plant from these wild hosts? How far are they actually moving? Clearly they can move fairly far. Do they move that far? I mean, I think that is an important question we're still trying to get a handle on. Let me just show you a few pictures of these things. I know these are common in Michigan as well. Several species of Lanicera bush honeysuckle that kind of, we call it twinberry as well, these red or orangish fruit. And on the right, they bloom early in the season and fruit for a long time period. So we think that's one of our more important ones. It's an invasive species and quite common in wild, disturbed lands around agricultural fields and other kind of disturbed lands. So this is definitely an important one. Rubus, you guys are all familiar with different types of wild blackberry that are growing around our fields. Gray dogwood, Cornus racemosa, kind of mid-season. We've got some amount of reproduction out of that. Silky dogwood, they like this one a lot, but we don't have a lot of silky dogwood in our area. But it was a fruit that they exploited quite well. But because it's not very abundant, I'm not convinced it's at least a very important source in our area. Pokeweed is a late season a native plant that the flies seem to like well in our area anyhow. There's been some other data suggesting it's not a great host, so that's kind of curious, but in our area we often find flies, we rear a lot of flies out of it, but it's very late season, August, and really September, October. Another common one we have, I think you have in Michigan too, is common buckthorn. It's very common invasive species, rhamnus, and it grows a lot around our agricultural areas. It's a later season ripening fruit, and the flies didn't do particularly well. We didn't rear a lot of flies out of it, but there is a lot of it. So that's one of these cases where it may be contributing to late season risk and certainly late season populations just because the plant in our area anyhow is quite abundant. This is a deadly bittersweet nightshade, excuse me, that bright red fruit that fruits kind of later season, midsummer to late season. We did rear flies from it, but not super high use pattern. Okay, so back to our questions, why should we care? I don't think they're having a big spring population on something, some kind of fruit or some sort of wild host that's fruiting in, let's say, April and May and June. At least our data doesn't suggest that. Could they be reproduced on something else? Maybe, although we don't catch a lot of flies in our traps until we start catching them in our crop plants in June, July. So if they are reproducing on something else, they're not attracted to these other trap lures that we're using. I do think there is a potential for building up populations on wild hosts, especially mid-season to late season, and they have a real potential for presenting a risk to our later season crops in late July, August, September. We do have evidence that they are moving from the outside into the crops. I think we need more data on that to figure out how far they're moving and to what extent, but that does seem to be going on. So yeah, wild hosts, I think, are playing a role in our problems with spotted wing Drosophila. Bless you. What's the management potential of having this sort of knowledge, and we're getting more and more of this from other areas, of which wild hosts are important reproductive hosts for spotted wing? And I'm still scratching my head a little bit. We certainly have growers here. I bet there's growers in Michigan that say, well, maybe we should be removing these wild hosts from the periphery of our plantings in order to at least delay or reduce the amount of infestation coming in from these wild hosts. And that's a question that I know Rufus Isaac's been asking. We've been trying to get a handle on it. It's kind of a hard experiment to do, but it's one that I think is an important one to answer. And I know some growers are actually going out and doing it. And it'll be interesting to see what the circumstantial data is with regards to its potential benefits. But we really do need to do some sort of experimental approach, and that's part of what we want to do in this SARI grant. Okay, I want to entertain some questions on this sort of topic of overwintering biology and wild hosts. I just wanted to acknowledge Anna Wallingford, a postdoc in my lab, who did a a lot of the work with overwintering biology, and Joanna Elfson, who was a research assistant in my lab for a couple of summers, and is now actually finishing her PhD with Hannah Barak down in North Carolina State, who did a lot of the work on biotopes. Okay, so let me kind of open up the area for questions, please.
Your graph showing very large trap catches in September and October in woods and in fields or in crops, does that suggest that traps are working better, or that there's just way more insects in that really late cooler time?
Yeah, I guess I'm not 100% sure, because we haven't well, that's not true. We have tested various traps throughout a whole season, and we see that trend in various types of traps and lures. So I think it's primarily due to just a big population at that time of year. There could be differences, though, in lures for, let's say, a female that's already into diapause may not be as attracted to certain lures than others. And I think that is an important question to sort out. Just like in the spring, flies that are ready to reproduce, and we have some data on this actually, are a little more attracted to fruit odors or a mixture of fruit odors than flies that are sort of not ready to reproduce and are really hungry. And they're going to these fermentation odors, presumably to kind of build up reserves and build up their egg laying capacity. So I think that you touch on a really important question about the status of the fly and how these lures would work. But I do think that there is very large populations that time of year.
Good question. One more question? Yeah.
Is it possible that during the springtime the adults are just feeding on the wild coasters because their eggs are not developed yet?
Can you hear that question?
Go ahead.
So the question, is it possible that in the springtime
Adults are just feeding
on these wild hosts
because the eggs still are not developed yet?
because the eggs aren't developed yet? Is that a possibility?
What I think's a good possibility is those flies that do survive the winter, things are warming up. Now that might be delayed if they are in the leaf litter, because those tend to be moderated. But as they get active, I think they do need to eat, and they can. We've even got data on this stuff, and other people do too. They'll feed on nectar, for example. They may feed on plant sap. They may feed on kind of old fruit that's still on the ground that kind of has made it through the winter. They don't seem to be able to develop eggs that way, but they could extend their survivorship some. They are ready to develop eggs, though, because when we give them a protein source, they will kind of switch to egg production. We need to do that experiment again, because we mainly did that experiment with flies, some or more flies. And we have to ask that question with flies that are truly overwintered to make sure they can do this. But I think they can. In fact, we did an experiment where we gave them bird poop along with sugar solution. So the bird feces is a protein source. They know that, and other things like apple maggot will feed on bird droppings and use that to develop eggs. And indeed, in our experiments, when we gave them a sugar source and bird droppings, they developed eggs quite promptly. So yeah, I think you're right that they can survive on these other things. And yet they do need some protein source to develop eggs when there is something to lay eggs in. Another aspect that it's possible, at least at a low level, is we find these flies utilizing mushrooms, surprisingly. And in fact, people have used mushrooms as a lure and caught a few spotted wing. We did a little bit of preliminary experiment on that, and if you give them a mushroom collected from the wild plus a sugar solution, they also will develop some eggs. So they might be using it at least as a protein source. I don't know if they can reproduce in it. I understand a colleague in Wisconsin might have some data on mushrooms as a possible reproductive source that I'm waiting to see. So that's kind of an intriguing possibility. I wanted to say, though, overall, and I'm going to put this out as a hypothesis, and I think Rufus doesn't fully agree with me on this, but that's fine. We'll try to sort this out. I think if it's a hard winter, the populations get knocked back in our area pretty severely. There may be a few surviving in kind of protected areas that could be our main source for infestations in the spring or early to midsummer. But I think we also may be getting flies migrating from the south, and that it might be a combination. Now, in mild winters, we actually may get much more survivorship, and I hope our experiments can help us kind of sort this out. I believe they see the same thing in Europe. There's a nice paper out, and I think, I don't know, is it Claudio who's going to talk later? I think he can probably address this. Mild winters, and they have bad seasons for spotted wing. Harsh winters, they don't have as bad a seasons, and that probably has to do with overwintering success.
And Larry, is that something you're going to talk a little bit later about? Okay. Emily had a couple questions, I think, from the Zoom folks.
Yep. So Greg, we have two questions. The first one is regarding management of wild posts. So is Cornell recommending any type of management of wild posts, particularly in wood edges adjacent to crops? And then the other question is, which lures are you using for trapping winter morphs?
Okay, so for the first question on management of wild hosts, we are not recommending at this time removal or somehow getting rid of fruit or somehow treating the wild hosts with insecticides, for example, which is primarily illegal anyhow. The reason being is, it's not trivial. It's a lot of effort, and I would like to have some data to sort of make that kind of recommendation. In addition, these wild hosts, we don't know, but they may be important in other ways. So certainly spraying insecticide in there, and you might be killing off natural enemies that are important, creating more problems than you're solving. Cutting them out may be helpful, especially these invasive species that we think are important, but they could be providing other benefits for natural enemies, et cetera, that I think we want to kind of evaluate before we make that recommendation. The second question is, we have not done a good examination of these different lure types for winter morph flies. We have used the century lure and also fermentation, kind of what we call the whole wheat dough sugar yeast bait. We tend to put that in a little ball in a separate cup receptacle, so we don't have to sort through that mess in the bottom of the cup. It kind of works the same pretty well as that slurry of a fermentation bait. So we've done both. What I don't have the data for is kind of comparing the relative capture of quote-unquote winter morph morphologies and summer morph morphologies in these two lure types.
Okay, very good. Greg, are you ready to move on to your next presentation?
I am, if I can figure out how to get to it. Let me exit.